of Worship, your source for commentary and discussion on worship, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me on the Act of Worship podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones, and I'm glad you've chosen to listen today. I am discussing today a theological issue. We've been stuck in the worship area the past few weeks, since this podcast started back, really, this fall. And today we are going to be looking at a theological issue. And I've titled this podcast, God is the Point of the Gospel. Now that could either go one of two ways in your mind right now. You might think, well, duh, yeah, God is the gospel. Or you might say, what do you mean? And so either way, whatever side you fall on, I want to discuss this issue. You see, selfishness has crept its way into the church over the years. And I think it's become detrimental to the point that Western culture has adopted a sort of false gospel in many ways. And I'm not just talking about the very obvious false gospels. For example, the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel. I'm talking about a gospel that really makes humankind the center and the point of the gospel rather than God. I remember a conversation with a friend years ago in which I suggested that God is primarily about his own glory. Everything that God does, every single work that is orchestrated in the history of the world, from creation to now and for eternity from here on, everything is about the glory of God. The Apostle Paul says that all things are from God, through God, and to God. And as in the words of John Piper, every roll of the dice in Las Vegas is orchestrated and ordained by him for his own glory. And some people might think, well, that's a stretch. I don't know what you're talking about here. And I had someone once ask me if that means we're just robots. And I said, no, it's actually worse than that. And when you read in Romans 9 that it's not just robots, but we're clay, and he is the potter. And so it's completely different. It's a different perspective from what many are taught. And I don't think purposely people teach a wrong gospel, but for some of us, the God that we were taught growing up is not the God that we realize later is the true God. And so my friend, when I suggested this, that God is about his own glory, he responded and he said, that makes God sound as if he's stuck on himself. And my response was, well, he is. Who else is he going to be stuck on? You or me or somebody less? God is the point of the gospel. And the gospel is not even about humankind, but it's solely about God's glory. And we know the gospel, the word gospel means good news. Well, what is the good news? We often get wrapped up in saying, well, that's the good news of salvation. That's only part of it. The real good news is that God receives glory through that salvation. Even the story of redemption among the people of God points to God's own glory and pleasure. It is not about us. And we so often try to make the gospel about us. Our selfishness, I think, is manifested in many ways. A common prayer among many believers sometimes is to pray for God to glorify himself by working through us. In other words, we desire him to work through us more than we desire him to work so that he is glorified. Let me ask you this. What if God decided to answer our prayer in that regard and decided to work, but he said, I'm going to work and I am going to make myself known, but I am going to work through someone else, not you? Or what if you prayed that as a church? God, use my church, or God, bring revival to my town. And God said, okay, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it through the church down the street. What if that was the response? How would you react? John Piper has written a book. By the way, if you cannot tell, I'm a big John Piper fan. He is not the only author I read. I read a lot of authors, but I have several of his books. But he's written a book called God is the Gospel. And the truth is that we need to desire God to work in spite of us rather than through us. We need to desire him to work, period, no matter how he works. Our desire should be for him to work. And so to give you an example of this, consider the story of Joseph. 14 chapters of Genesis are devoted to this narrative of Joseph. It's a story with which many people are familiar and a story that teaches valuable lessons. And sometimes, unfortunately, that's all we use the story for, is for lessons. And it's so much more than that. But it's become a story that effectively promotes therapeutic moralistic deism, in which we gain insights from the text and believe that if we make the right decisions living a decent life, we're going to be blessed as Joseph was. Yeah, he went through some difficult circumstances, but ultimately things worked out for him. And what's fascinating about the story of Joseph is that while Joseph takes up the most space in this narrative, and he is the main character, he is not the point. Okay, the story of Joseph really happened. It's not, this isn't meant to imply that it's just a story. These accounts really happen. But Joseph is not the point of the narrative, because that role belongs to Judah. In fact, the reason God placed Joseph in a place of authority through his trials and his circumstances was to eventually preserve the life of Judah, who likely would have died without the help of his brother Joseph. And even though Judah is not mentioned as often as Joseph, and you see Joseph throughout the story, you only see Judah a little bit, it was through the line of Judah that the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would come. And the role for Judah, although was seemingly small in this narrative, was the most important role. When I first realized that, it really encouraged me, because there are times where I think, God, what are you doing in my life? Well, I haven't led 10 billion people to Christ. I mean, what's going on? I was supposed to do that. Yet God has a purpose for each of us. We fit into his plan. It's not about us. It's not about us being used even. And certainly we do have the privilege of being used, but it may be in a vastly different way than what we think. It may be in a smaller way, or seemingly smaller way than what we think. For many of us, if we were in Judah's shoes, we would not be okay with that, because Joseph receives the attention. But yet look what happened. Judah was the one, through his lineage, the Messiah would come. And so sometimes we pray for God to move, but we desire him to move so that we receive at least a little recognition. It broke my heart when I was in college, in my younger 20s, or maybe I was in grad school. I was talking to someone, and we were just on fire for Christ and just talking about what we wanted to do for the Lord. And we wanted to preach the gospel here and there. And we talked about, man, I would do anything. I would go to any country. I'd go wherever. The one thing we agreed on, and it broke my heart when I realized it, was that we didn't know if the one thing we would not be okay with was if nobody knew who we were. If we went somewhere to preach the gospel, but nobody knew it. What if that was what God called you to? Go preach the gospel. Nobody's ever going to know who you are. Nobody's going to know how you die. You're going to die a brutal death, and no one will ever know it. Your name will be completely unknown. Would you be okay with that? We spend our time ministering and claiming a desire solely for God's glory, and sometimes that's a mask that really hides our selfishness. And so it's vital that we realize God is the point of the gospel, not us, not any human being. The gospel is not preached just for the salvation of people. It is actually preached primarily for the glory of God. The salvation of people is subsequent to the glory of God. And when we realize how God-centered the gospel is, and when our perspective changes, other things in our life also change. And so I want to suggest 4 aspects that change in our lives when our perspective on the gospel changes. First, when our perspective on the gospel changes, on the point of the gospel, our prayers also change. We stop treating God as a genie in a bottle and asking for what we want in our selfishness. We stop praying on the foundation of what we want, and we begin to pray based on what God desires. Our prayers, when our perspective changes, our prayers are not even founded on our good or the good of other people, but rightly on the pleasures of God. It's likely that when we consider how we pray, when you think about how you pray, you begin to realize that your prayers are usually selfish. In other words, we often pray based on our good and what's good for us more than God's pleasure and delight. But the thing is, when our delight is rooted in God's delight, our prayers are subsequently affected. We don't pray anymore for God to use us, but rather to use us or anyone He chooses because we are seeking His glory. And so if you want God to use you, ask yourself why. Is it so that He receives glory and pleasure, or is it so that you might be seen? And maybe it's for the supposed glory of Christ. You're praying, God, use me because I want you to be seen. But when you strip away all that's there and get to the root of why you want that, is it for you or is it truly for the glory of Christ? There's a fine line between a desire for God to use us and a desire for people to see God using us. And when our perspective on the gospel shifts to a solely God-centered and God-exalting gospel, our prayers change. Secondly, our joy changes. We find our joy in God's joy. Even in persecution, sickness, suffering, and depression, we live with a hope and a joy like none other because it's not rooted in our circumstances. So many times we can claim the joy of Christ when the situations are at least okay. Most of us can do okay. When it starts getting really bad, that's difficult, and it's difficult to realize God's joy when our circumstances are dire. But by joy, I don't imply happiness, but what I mean is a supreme satisfaction and delight in God. How do you think the Apostle Paul said, I have found the secret to joy in having much or little? He's content. I can be content in having much or little, in good or bad, no matter what the situation is. Joy does not mean freedom from difficulty, including sickness, financial trouble, loss of job, legal troubles, or even depression, whatever the case may be. If joy in Christ meant that life would be absent of these things, a lot of Christians over the centuries have been cheated. And joy in Christ does not mean freedom from trials, but freedom despite them. Without a proper gospel perspective, the circumstances will continue to rule our lives, and we won't know the joy of the Lord, and we will continue to see the gospel through the grid of ourselves. And we'll continue to ask questions like, God, if you love me, then why did you do this? These types of questions are indicative of the wrong perspective on the gospel. God is the point of the gospel, not humanity. The third suggestion I have is that when our perspective on the gospel changes, our reason for evangelism also changes. Years ago, prior to my shift in this perspective, And by saying that, I don't mean that I don't struggle with that shift still. There are certainly times it's a continuous struggle. But when I first started realizing that the gospel is not about humanity, it's not about me, it's not even about other people, it's not even about lost people, the gospel is about God. When I started realizing that, prior to that, I believed that I was to preach the gospel so that lost people are saved. But this is only a half-truth. You see, the gospel is not about people, but it's about God. And so when our perspective on the gospel changes, we preach out of an abundant joy in the Lord. Our overflowing satisfaction in Christ then causes us to declare who He is because we have tasted and seen that He's good, as the psalmist says. So evangelism becomes about declaring God, not convincing people to trust Him. When people see as we have seen, they then trust Him. It's not our job to save people. Hear me on that. It is not our job to save people. We have no power to do so. It's our job to know God and to make Him known. Why does God save people? For His glory. Why did Christ die? For God's glory. Why do we preach the gospel? For God's glory, not the salvation of humanity. People's salvation is a byproduct of declaring God. Everything stems from God's glory. It is about Him. The glory of God is always the issue. When we realize that God is the point of the gospel, our selfishness fades away and we declare God because we want people to know who He is and not just receive salvation from hell. If people are saved because they don't want to go to hell, they've missed the point. The Apostle Paul said that we are saved to be conformed to the image of Christ. We are not saved so that we don't go to hell. That is not the point. And if that's why you received Christ, then maybe you didn't receive Him. If you would be okay with going to heaven without Christ there, then you probably will not be in heaven. God is the point of the gospel. The last suggestion I have is that our desire for God to work through us changes to a desire for Him to work however He wishes. In our metamorphosis from selfishness to God-centered selflessness, we certainly should desire God to work, but we should desire Him to work however He wishes and through whomever He wishes. We have the privilege in the body of Christ of being used by God, but our desire should not be for God to use us, not solely for Him to use us, but for Him to work in any way He sees fit, whether through us or through someone else, and whether through our church or another church. As a minister, I openly confess that this is quite difficult because I want God to use me in what He's called me to. He's called me to a particular ministry, and I want Him to use me in that. But a proper gospel perspective should cause us to seek God's work and simply do what He has called us to, irrespective of how or even whether He uses us. So He's called me, so I must go and I must do as He commands, regardless of the outcome. What if His call was as clear as this? What if God said to me or to you, what if He said, go and preach? But there is not going to be a visible outcome. You're going to be tortured, and no one will come to know me, but go. What if He said that? Just obey. There's not going to be any sort of outcome that you'll see, but go. What would your response be? I would dare say that it would be difficult for most people to obey. Is the question I would have then, if that's the case, if we go because of the response and not the command, is not the call of God enough? Should we not go and should we not preach on the sole basis that He has called us? There's an old Stephen Curtis Chapman song. Many of you know this. It says, we will abandon it all for the sake of the call. No other reason at all but the sake of the call. Man, that should be our desire. That should be our prayer, our thought, our concept that we go for the sake of the call. No other reason. We're not going because of these massive responses that are going to happen on the other side, which we don't know whether or not they will happen. You may see millions or thousands come to know Christ through your ministry. You may see nothing. We go for the sake of the call. And so while we should desire God to work, we should not try to dictate how he works. We should seek his glory and simply obey. Jesus is not only at the center, but he is everywhere. It's not uncommon for us to hear Christians speak of God in terms of capacity in their lives. In other words, he's a number on a priority list, or he is the center of what occurs in someone's life. Jesus, however, should not be number one on a priority list. He should be the entire priority list, the first and foremost person in and being in every aspect of life. He shouldn't be simply at the center of life, but everywhere in life. The center, the inside, the outside, the edges, everything. The gospel, the meta-narrative of the Bible, and even the message we are to proclaim is not centered around humanity or even the salvation of humanity, but around and about God himself. Salvation is a God-honoring, God-exalting, and God-glorifying result of the gospel, yet God himself is the point of the gospel. We are merely declaring who he is. And when we realize this truth, that God is the point of the gospel, our perspective changes. And when our perspective changes, our lives change. Thank you for listening to the Act of Worship podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones.